Good evening, everybody. I'm so glad you're here. If your social media or Facebook or Instagram is anything like mine, our faces popped up on ads every other post. So I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad you found this event. And I'm super excited. You know, as we were preparing for this event and working with Democracy First to compile the questions, I would be just as excited to be just an observer of this conversation, let alone the moderator of this. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation here tonight with Richard Primus. I will say this too, it definitely feels like Michigan is the center of the universe right now. I think we can all agree on that. So I'm really appreciative of Democracy First making Michigan such an important focus. You know, we've been through a lot, I think, over these last 4 years. I'm a state senator for this district. Know several of you in the audience tonight. I also chair our elections committee in the Michigan Senate. And, you know, it just feels like we are living through history year after year after year here in Michigan. But Michigan has played an oversized role, I think, in protecting our democracy through the course of time. I often think about in the period of the Civil War, when Michigan had more Union troops and cavalry than any other union or any other state in the Union as a proportion of their population. And Abraham Lincoln said, "Thank God for Michigan." So again, you know, here we are standing up and standing strong in this harrowing and seminal moment in our democracy. And I think that those of us who are in the room here tonight doing the work, you know, maybe a future historian looking back on this moment will say, thank God for Michigan. So I want to at least kick off our discussion here tonight with Richard Primus by asking a question about really the foundation and the start of our country here. And, you know, Dr. Primus, your work on constitutional history sheds light on how the U.S. Constitution was framed to prevent tyranny and to protect democratic governance. So I would like you to start off by at least illuminating for the room here tonight. Can you talk about the basic theory that animated the framers of the Constitution and some of the key mechanisms that they created to guard against tyranny and corruption?
Sure. And thank you for coming to moderate the discussion. Thank all of you for coming out to participate. And thanks to the organizers also for inviting me. The framers of the Constitution were acutely aware of an important fact about the human condition, which is that governments fall. Right? All governments eventually fall. Right? By the time they wrote the Constitution, they had been through 2 regime collapses in their own adult lives, right? First, the collapse of the British colonial administration, and then the sort of running aground of the system under the Articles of Confederation. And they thought it was really important, if they were going to try to do something better, to be attentive to what it is that makes governments decay and fall. They were close to obsessed with historical learning about the fall of governments. They read a lot about Rome and how Rome went from being a healthy republic to being something that was corrupt at the core and would fall. And they were primarily worried about 2 things, because they wanted to have a democratic republic. They were clear about that, right? And different kinds of governments are vulnerable to different kinds of pathologies. And the question is, what are the kinds of things that might make that kind of government decay and fall? And the framers came to 2 answers. There are 2 things. One is the thing that we call the tyranny of the majority, right? A situation where you have 51% that calls all the shots and runs roughshod over the lives and interests and rights of the other 49%. That's not sustainable. And the other is corruption, the kind of corruption that causes elections to be unreliable, or simply to put in place people who will not act in the public interest, right? And for officials just to be corrupt in that sense. Those were the 2 things that they most wanted to avoid. And they designed a system that was intended to be responsive to those 2 problems. So to meet the problem of the tyranny of the majority, right, they gave us what we know as the system of checks and balances, right? The idea that rather than putting power anywhere where one majority could control it, they would divide it up a bunch of ways. In their day, it was well understood that the most dangerous branch of the government was the legislature. That's where the real power was, and therefore that's where the danger was. So that's where what had to be checked the most. That's why we have a bicameral Congress, right? And why most American states have bicameral state legislatures, right? We don't divide the other branches in the same way. We divide that one because it's the most powerful branch. And it's easy for some self-interested cabal to take control of one meeting than to take control of two separate meetings, right? So the thought was divide the legislature. The presidential veto was also a kind of check that was supposed to work that way. The courts were actually much less of a check then than now, but they played some checking role, right? That's one set of mechanisms. That's one set of mechanisms, and it's the set that was designed to meet the problem of the tyranny of the majority. But the framers knew that a structure, no matter how clever, would not be sufficient to let the republic operate and thrive properly if the people in office lacked all civic virtue, right? They didn't expect office holders to be paragons of virtue. James Madison in the Federalist Papers famously writes, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. So they understood they were planning a government in which the office holders would be flawed human people, right? But we're all flawed, right? The question is, can you have flawed people who have enough civic virtue, enough public-mindedness, that they can carry out the system properly, rather than one that just becomes corrupt and self-interested? So they needed mechanisms for trying to recruit office holders that would have at least a tolerable amount of civic virtue. And they did it in two core ways. The first was to emphasize the importance of local government, right? Very local government. And populations then were much smaller than they are now, right? So constituencies were much smaller than they are now. And the thought is, you can fool a bunch of strangers, and it's easier to con a crowd of strangers than it is to con 50 people who live in your neighborhood who interact with you day to day. So if they could have a bunch of government be local, that would screen out a bunch of the people who had no civic virtue at all, because their neighbors wouldn't hand them power, right? So hence federalism. The other mechanism was for the most powerful positions at the national level to have indirect mechanisms of election that would vest judgment in people who were informed about the candidates, right? We had indirect elections for the Senate in the beginning, and most importantly, there we go. And most importantly, we had the Electoral College. The Electoral College, as the framers understood it, was a very different institution from the one that we have now. It fulfilled a critically different function. Today, right, what we all know, what the Electoral College does is it translates the power of each state into a certain proportion of the power to elect the presidency, but the electors themselves are rubber stamps, right? They don't make any decisions about who the president should be. That wasn't the framers' conception. The framers' conception was the electors are actually the electors. They are going to exercise independent judgment and make the choice. And the reason was they understood you can con a great big crowd of strangers much better than you can con a small group of people who are informed and experienced and chosen for their judgment. So the idea was that by selecting the president through a small group of people who were relatively well-informed, they could avoid the thing that they were most concerned about in the second dimension, which was the demagogue, right? The corrupt, demagogic leader who rides to power on the basis of conning a large part of the public and takes power. The system was set up to prevent that. Those were the critical mechanisms, right, to do those things for the framers to try to keep the government healthy.
So you're talking about what they were thinking in 1787, 1788. We're living here in 2024, far removed from that. What mechanisms, how have they changed over time, and which of those mechanisms still kind of remain the same today?
Okay, so some things are the same. Right? We still have the basic architecture of the separation of powers. We still have a bicameral Congress. I'm sure Senator Moss knows this very well. Sometimes the checks and balances of a bicameral legislature are intensely frustrating.
Intensely frustrating.
Right? I mean, if your party won the most recent election, you would like to get things done, right? And when you would like to get things done, checks and balances are a pain in your neck, right? But the Constitution exists to protect us from our own best intentions, right? Sometimes, that's the price we pay for avoiding tyranny and certain kinds of corruption, right? And we still have the bicameral Congress. The presidential veto is a stronger checking mechanism now than it was for the framers. In the early years of the Republic, vetoes were rare. In fact, there was a considerable school of thought at the beginning that the president should veto only a law that he thought was unconstitutional, in the way that we think of now as the courts striking something down. That policy disagreement was not ground for a veto. That fell away over time, right? But in the framers' era, that was the basic thought. That means on the one hand, we have more of a check. On the other hand, it means we have a much more powerful presidency, right, than we had then, right? The courts are more of a check now than they were earlier. But right, and mentioned this earlier, we have also lost some of the mechanism. We've lost the mechanism of indirect election and the Electoral College, right? We don't have that safety net anymore. The importance of preventing self-interested, corrupt demagogues from exercising a lot of power is as strong now as it ever was. But now the responsibility to block the demagogue from taking office rests solely on the voters. Solely, right? There's no institutional mechanism as a backup, right, if the voters don't come through.
Talk about the evolution of the voters. I mean, so the framers didn't see so much power being held in the voters originally. What would they be? What would they think of the voters' participation in a presidential campaign or in our election system?
So it's super hard. This is always a thought experiment that people ask constitutional lawyers to do, right? What would the framers think about? And it's a really hard thought experiment because you have to ask this question. If you imagine, I now have a line to James Madison and I can have a conversation with him and ask him I'll describe something to him and ask him, what do you think about this? What other information do I give him, right? Am I expecting him to be who he was circa 1800 and evaluate? Or do I get to explain to him all the ways that the world has developed and changed from 1800 to now, right? Because if you imagine that, look, he was a smart and inquisitive sort of person, right? Flawed human being, right? But actively thinking about what to do. I imagine that to answer that question, he would have some questions for us, right? How did you get from the world I knew to the world in which you're asking me this question? Tell me that before you ask me for an opinion, right? And my best guess is that if the framers were to be educated about what has happened in the succeeding 200 years, they would think about these questions not so differently from the way that we think about these questions, right? They would become us, more or less. Now, they would bring some of their own preoccupations with them, right? Americans alive today have, if they've lived their whole life in this country, have no experience of regime collapse, right? We take the rule of law for granted. The rule of law is not the natural condition of humanity. It's not how most people have lived most of the time. It is an exception. And it's not magic that once it's there, it stays. It needs tending. People who have been through regime turmoil probably have a finer sensitivity to that than people like most of us who have not, because the framers lived through something like that, right? I imagine that after we like brought them up to speed about what the world is like now, right, they would keep one eye firmly on that set of concerns in whatever opinion they would express about, you know, what we ought to do next.
One thing that they did not put in the Constitution, and something that we have just this expectation of how government works, is the two-party system. Can you talk about, you know, how that has evolved over time? And again, you know, if you could call Benjamin Franklin, what do you think that he would say, or what do you think James Madison would say about the partisanship, the two-party system that we have here today that isn't going to change anytime soon?
Sure. So as you said, the Constitution was written to function without political parties. Madison and the Federalist, the word that Madison uses in the Federalist Papers to mean what we mean by a political party is faction, and it's a dirty word. Madison conceives of faction or party as the most dangerous thing about a democratic system, because it can be a cabal that pursues some interest that isn't the general public interest, right? And so the Constitution was written to function without political parties. Humanity being what it is, it didn't take long for political parties to evolve anyway, right? It took about a dozen years. And ironically, with Madison being one of the most important organizers of political parties when they came about, right? And the first crisis, and so when you have a system that's built to work not with political parties, and it turns out there are political parties, that could go a bunch of different ways, right? It could mean breakdown, or it could mean accommodation. For the first half of the 20th century, they managed to find an accommodation. And the key thing that enabled the accommodation, the key moment that enabled the accommodation, was the transfer of power in 1801 from John Adams to Thomas Jefferson. 1796, George Washington retires. Adams and Jefferson run against each other for the presidency. Adams wins. 4 years later, in 1800, the same two candidates run against each other, and there's a more crystallized party system this time, and Jefferson wins. Now, what does that mean? It means that for the first time in the history of mass national democracy, a head of state, like the person to whom the military responds, is being asked to go away, to voluntarily step away from that power for no better reason than that there was an election that chose someone else, right? We say, well, of course, that's how it happened. It had never happened before, right? It had not happened before. Washington handed off to Adams, no big deal. Adams was Washington's chosen successor, right? And it was not clear that it was going to happen peacefully. There were state militias on one side or another that were prepared to march on Washington, right, in favor of their preferred candidate. It didn't come to that. It didn't come to that because neither Adams nor Jefferson wanted it to come to that. Most importantly, because Adams didn't want it to come to that, right? It helped that Adams and Jefferson had mutual respect personally. Even they had worked together. They disagreed about a lot of things, but they had also been through a bunch together. They recognized each other as patriots, as capable people. And Adams was wise enough to recognize I tell my students when I teach introductory constitutional law, the first rule of constitutional government is also the first rule of playground basketball. The rule is no one can get bigger than the game, right? Like, you have to be willing to take your losses, right? If winning is more important than respecting your opponent in the spirit of the game will break down. There will be no game, right? That is indispensable, right? Adams understood that, right? And he didn't like the idea that Jefferson was taking over, but he said, but this is how it is, right? And he stepped away. That set a good precedent, and it was a precedent that lasted for about half a century, right? It lasted until a different party competition deepened over the issue of slavery, right? So the Republican Party comes into existence in the 1850s as an anti-slavery party, and it becomes the party of the North. The Democratic Party is mostly the party of the South, and it's a pro-slavery party. And the first time a Republican nominee for president wins, right, Lincoln in 1860, most of the Democratic Party, instead of saying what Adams said in 1800, they say, no, we don't accept this. Like, we're taking our ball and going home. We're out, right? The system broke down, and this gave us the Civil War, right? Which killed off more than 1% of the population and was an enormously destructive, tragic event, right? But it taught a lesson, because the generation that came to leadership after the Civil War was one of those generations that had been through a society in collapse, right? They were sensitized to what that was like, and what they had learned was it's not good to have a civil war, right? It's not, right? It's much better to it's much better to keep to the playground basketball rules and not to do that. It took until the 1890s to really work it out. But by the 1890s, the two parties sort of coalesced into a tacit arrangement that's something like a cooperative competition, right? A game of tennis or a game of playground basketball is cooperative competition, right? It's a competition. Each party wanted to win each election, right? But it was cooperative in the sense that they understood that they were playing a game with each other that they intended to continue, and that each side needed the other not to burn the thing down, right, when they lost. And on the understanding that that was better than civil war, they managed. There's a piece of this that's that Americans don't usually remember, because we have very little space in our historical memories for the Spanish-American War. Like, who cares about the Spanish-American War? In 1898, we have the Spanish-American War. And the significance of it is, it's the first time since the Civil War that people, regardless of party, are fighting together, same side, shoulder to shoulder, right? It consolidates the idea that we have party competition, but they're not the enemy. The enemy is out there, right? And that sense lasted, right, and kept the two-party system functional within the constitutional structure for about 100 years, right? Through a time when the lesson that the Spanish-American War enabled was often reinforced, right? The 20th century is full of external threat. World wars, Cold War, right? With that as background, the leadership of both political parties know that one of their highest responsibilities is to cooperate with the leadership of the other political party, right, in defense of the system as a whole against the real threat, which is outside. Like, we disagree with each other. We're competing. I would like to beat you at the next election, and you would like to beat me, right? But we're all in the end loyal to the same constitutional system, right? The real enemy is out there, and that means we need playground basketball rules. That enabled, here are a couple of really good examples of things that enabled. In 1960, Richard Nixon and John Kennedy run for president. They did not like each other, right? The election was very, very close. Kennedy won, but there were a lot of people in the Republican Party who thought that Nixon should like go to the mattresses challenging the result because it was very close. And there were people in the Republican Party who thought there was a shenanigan here and there was a shenanigan there, and Nixon is the rightful winner. And Nixon said, no, right? He did what Adams did, right? And said, no, like we don't do that, right? We don't, because if we push all the way to crisis, there's no safety net, right? So like, I'm gonna step back. 40 years later, the shoe's on the other foot in the partisan sense, but it's a replay, right? The election in 2000 between Al Gore and George W. Bush, extremely close, heavily contested, a lot of people in the Democratic Party, right, with the belief that Gore was the real winner of the election. But there was a legal process which awarded the presidency to Bush, and Al Gore went on national television and said, I accept the decision, right? Because Nixon in his turn and Gore in his understood what Adams understood, right? That the system works on playground basketball rules and not otherwise.
It's really interesting. I mean, we think about the peaceful transfer of power from administration to administration, and we kind of look at that George Washington decision to retire as the hallmark of that. But really, it's the John Adams decision after losing an election that really has set the foundation of what successive presidencies have done.
I think that's right. I mean, constitutional democracy requires the buy-in of the losers of elections, right?
Yeah.
There's like it's indispensable. Without it, you're not operating constitutional democracy.
So we've talked a lot about presidential politics and the evolution of that over time. You teased this in that 2000 election example, the role of courts. So, you know, when most people think about the Constitution, they think about the court system. How has that evolved over time? Talk about its role.
Okay. So we today think of just basic civics, right? We think of the federal government and most of the state governments as having three co-equal branches of government. It's never been the case that the three branches were all equally powerful. And at the founding, the courts were the least powerful branch, and they stayed not very powerful relative to the other two branches through most of the 19th century. We all know, right, Chief Justice John Marshall in Marbury versus Madison establishing the idea of judicial review, right, that the court has the power to say that the law is unconstitutional. Before the Civil War, the Supreme Court exercises that power a bunch of times with respect to state laws, but essentially never with respect to federal law, right? There are exactly two cases before the Civil War in which the Supreme Court gets in the way of the federal government. The first is in Marbury, where they don't really get in the way. I mean, it's a longer, intricate story, but you may know that what actually comes out of the Marbury case is a political victory for the Jefferson administration. So the court is not getting in the way, right? The only other law before the Civil War that the Supreme Court ever said, federal law, that the Supreme Court ever said was unconstitutional was the Missouri Compromise. And by the time they said that, the Missouri Compromise had been superseded by statute for years, right? It wasn't even the law anymore, right? Why did the court never strike down federal laws or get in the way of the federal government at all, really, before the war? Because it didn't have the legitimacy or the buy-in to do it. For a court to be able to practice judicial review against the political branches of its own government, it needs people to have a strong sense that the court is not just some other partisan actor, and it needs to have the buy-in of the major political powers so that they don't, when they lose, say, we're just not listening, right? And the Supreme Court was not an institution like that before the Civil War because, you probably know this, the Supreme Court that we know has 9 justices, but the number 9 does not appear in the Constitution, right? Under the Constitution, Congress, by statute, sets the size of the Supreme Court. And before the Civil War, the consistent practice was that if your party took control of the presidency and both houses of Congress, you would pack the court. You would change the number of justices on the Supreme Court so that you could ensure that judges from your own ideological coalition would dominate the court, right? Over and over again, right? This happened through the 1870s. Between the 1870s and the end of the 19th century, as part of the same, like, coming to appreciate that pushing all the way to crisis is bad, that gave us a stable two-party system, the two parties also said, maybe we should stop packing the court, right? It requires mutual confidence, right? The Democrats have to be confident that the Republicans are not going to pack the court, and the Republicans have to be confident that the Democrats are not going to pack the court. But once they reached that détente, the courts could then be an institution that was sufficiently independent of the other branches that it could have the legitimacy to say, no, this is unconstitutional, or to stand up to the other branches and to be relatively confident that other government officials, including the ones who command the army, will not just roll over them. But it requires the buy-in of the two political parties, right, to that idea. And that requires each political party to have confidence that, sometimes you're going to lose and sometimes I'm going to lose, and we're both going to take our losses. And because that détente was reached, the Supreme Court through the 20th century became a significantly more powerful institution and much more like the institution that we know today. But the Supreme Court, not just the Supreme Court, the judiciary as a whole, I mean, indispensably important. If again, the rule of law is not a thing to be taken for granted. I have a very wise colleague who says people who are inclined to doubt the value of the rule of law should contemplate carefully what life is like in societies where it is missing, right? And a well-functioning independent judicial system is really important for the rule of law. But it is a mistake to forget that it is the least powerful branch of the government, right? It functions only with the permission, by the buy-in of the other branches, right? The great Justice Robert Jackson, who served on the US Supreme Court for a long stretch in the middle of the 20th century, and who, in addition to being a justice of the Supreme Court, was the chief allied prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, right? Someone who knew something about societal collapse and demagoguery, said over and over again, if the rest of the government becomes tyrannical, if there is a president who wants to be a dictator, we, the court, will not be able to stop it. We do not have the heft to be able to do it. We can put up a little resistance for a little bit of time, but the only power sufficient to stop a president who wants to be a bully, right, a dictator, is the electorate.
Good segue, talking about where we are right now and the electorate before us. Part of the core tenet of democracy first is making sure that we're electing the right type of person. I'm not talking liberal or conservative or Republican or Democrat. I'm talking about people who will follow the rule of law. And the people who, in your example, know that the game is bigger than the players. So thinking of the things that have happened over this last century that have kind of contributed to the precarious moment that we're in right now, what do you think are those factors that have contributed to it? I think that you can include the diminished experience of office holders. I think that you can include the problem of disinformation and misinformation and foreign interference in our politics. So leading off of those two things, and you can expand on that, what are things that have contributed to where we are right now?
So I think you've named the most important ones, right? The political parties, the major parties, used to vet candidates for office in ways that they mostly don't anymore. Not that there's no party vetting, of course there is, right? But it used to be that if you wanted to hold high office, chances were you had to work your way up from small office first, right? You would hold some local office, which means you had to be the sort of person whose neighborhood was willing to trust them, right? You would work your way up. Maybe you would serve in a state legislature. You would get some experience. A lot of other people in your community would learn whether you were trustworthy and whether you were capable, right? And if you were, you could gradually work your way up, right? The downside of that system was that high office was mostly reserved for members of an insiders club, right? That's a downside, right? The upside to that system was the people we got in high office were mostly pretty capable, right? Not all of them. Like at any time slice of American history, you'll find a certain number of bozos in high office, right? Can't be helped. But that was the trade-off, right? If you think about the run of presidents we had through the middle of the 20th century, right, the time that I identified as when the two-party system tended to work well here, let's say like from FDR to the end of the Cold War to George H.W. Bush, like if we all sat here in the room and ranked them, we would have different views about who were the better and worst presidents during that time, right? And none of us is going to like all of them. But as a group, they were a pretty capable bunch of people, right? They were all like experienced public servants with views of the public interest and so on and so on and so forth. In our century, the parties don't perform the vetting function nearly as much as they used to, partly because of the way that campaigns are funded now. It's much easier for people with no public service experience and no experience being responsible to an actual local constituency to just decide, I want to be senator or I want to be governor, right? And run directly for that office, or even for president. And when people come to the office that way, it means they haven't been vetted, right, by the local community or by people with experience operating the government. It also means they're more likely to be people who are accustomed to just calling the shots how they want them, right? Because they're not people who got there by like working with other people, right? They're people who got there by just forcing their way in some sense. So that's a problem. The other big thing that I would point to is the information environment, right? So through the Franklin Roosevelt to George H.W. Bush stretch, we had a pretty good information environment in the United States for constitutional democracy. It was the era of radio and then television, and the structure of the news industry was such that there was a limited number of suppliers competing with each other, right? I mean, in the second half of that period, it's 3 major national television networks, and they're all competing for the same mainstream audience, right? Which means they don't have like distinctive partisan slants. They get a lot of commonly shared information out to a very broad public, right? That's really useful, right? I don't need to, we all have a much more fractured information environment today. It's an environment where many people are never confronted with facts that they don't like, or discount entirely. And the problem of foreign disinformation is one that I don't think we have a solution. I mean, imagine how much the leadership of the Soviet Union would have loved to be able to run a social media disinformation campaign against candidate Ronald Reagan in 1980, right? Had the technology and the information environment at the time been conducive for it. They would have gone to town, right? It could have changed the course of their history, right? We face that problem today in a quite serious way. We don't have a solution for it yet. I don't have a solution for it. I know one thing that can help at the retail level. That is to say, it's not something that like will solve the problem for millions of people, but it's a practice that I recommend when people ask me, what can I do about this, just in my own citizenship. And it's this. when you're thinking about who to vote for in an election, whatever your partisan priors are, right, look at the candidate who the party that you usually favor is nominating, and then see if you can, just a little bit of research, right? I mean, Google for 10 minutes. Can you find people affiliated with that same party who are saying, I'm not supporting this person, and giving reasons, right? Those people are more likely to be reliable sources of information than other sorts of people speaking about it, because they're not just prosecuting a partisan interest, right? Something about that candidacy bothers them enough that they're going against their usual interest. It's a general principle in the law that a statement against interest is considered credible, right? Because why would you be saying that, right? I don't think, we don't have the kind of society in which we can force everyone to do those 10 minutes of research, right? But in your own individual choices, or the people ask you, what can I possibly do? That's my first recommendation.
I want to go back. That's profound. I mean, that's a really good piece of advice for people who are facing choices in front of them. I want to go back to something you had mentioned. You know, there used to be a time when you ran for office and you listed your credentials, and those credentials could include, you know, congressman, senator, governor, that was an asset. Now it seems like the asset for some candidates is saying, I'm an outsider. I'm not part of the institution. I have no experience. That's my benefit to this role. How did that evolve over time? How did that evolve from FDR to where we are today?
So, you know, it's complicated. It waxes and wanes. There have always been two competing impulses that are present, right? One is trust experience and steady hands. And the other is throw the bums out, right? And democracy works well when a majority of the people know which one is the better choice at any given moment, right? Without the possibility of throwing the bums out, you have no constitutional democracy, right? So, and there have been moments when incumbency has been too much of an advantage for a healthy constitutional democracy. In many respects, in most American elections, it's still like that. I mean, the number of uncontested or virtually uncontested seats in the U.S. House of Representatives, right, for example, is very high, right? It would be better if it weren't, because it encourages polarization, right? The problem, let's distinguish between two things, though. One is the person who says, I'm not an insider. I'm coming from the outside. I have some fresh ideas. I'm going to be different, right? Support me because I'm different. But who takes government seriously, right? Who knows that government is hard, right? Government is hard because society is complicated, right? A person who says, this is all really easy, right? Just put me in and I'll fix it all, right? Like, you can't run a business or a sports team or a family that way. You can't run a superpower nation of 300 million people that way. Society is complicated, right? The danger, so sometimes people come in without experience and they bring fresh ideas, and it's healthy, right, to have some number of people like that in the mix. The problem is people who would like to come in without experience and who don't take seriously that, like, this is hard, this is complicated, I have things to learn, right? I don't have all the answers yet. One of the greatest American judges never to sit on the Supreme Court was a judge you may be familiar to some of you, a man named Learned Hand, which is a great name if you're going to be a judge, right? Learned Hand famously said, the spirit of liberty is the spirit that is not too sure that it is right, right? The danger is the office holder who with no experience, like, says, I've got all the answers.
Has this been an evolution to where we are now, or has this been a pendulum? Is there a comparable time to where we are now in American history? Can we expect the pendulum to swing back?
Right. So, well, okay. Um, history never repeats itself, right? It's ooh, who said that? Right, but it rhymes, right? There's like I was raised on the George Santayana line that people who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. It's a very catchy line, and I understand what it's supposed to teach us. It's supposed to teach us to be aware of our history, and that's a good lesson. But it's wrong, right? It's not the case that people who don't remember their history are condemned to repeat it, because history never repeats itself. History never repeats itself because society is too complicated. There are too many variables, right? The time we're living through now isn't exactly like the 1850s or the 1930s or the 1780s or any other like time when the foundations of a society are sort of being questioned, right? It has a little in common with this one, and it has a little in common with that one, and it has a little bit in common with that. I mean, any of you who have families with several children, you know, like your youngest kid is not like exactly any of your other kids. You can see some of kid 1 in kid 4 and some of kid 2 in kid 4. It's the same thing, right? So we can draw analogies, right, from earlier times. We shouldn't become prisoners of those analogies, right? That's a mistake, right? We have to, because what we face now is not quite like what we faced at earlier times. But here's one respect in which it is like what we faced at what people faced at earlier times, right? One respect. When we think about what are the previous great like challenges to constitutional democracy in America, the 1780s, right, in the transition from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, the breakdown that leads to the Civil War, right, and the Civil War itself, the 30s and 40s, right, the Great Depression and the Second World War, right? The thing about us is we know how all the stories come out because we live after, right? But if you're a person who was living through any of those things, you don't know how the story comes out, right? You have to do your best in that situation with no guarantee that the ship comes through to safety on the other side, right? We share that with them, right? Not with people who lived through the 1860s or the 1940s as they were 20 years later, but as they were at the time without knowing, right? We can add to the list, right? Like, while it's happening, you don't know the end, right? You do know this, or at least I think you do. Those of us who have known, all of us have, right, people who lived through times of real crisis. If you live through a time like that, and almost everybody does at some point if they live a long life, you judge yourself for the rest of your life on the basis of what you did during that time period, right? And you have to face that time period without knowing how it comes out until the work is done.
We have a lot of challenges before us, and it feels like we're living in history. We can recognize that we're living in that moment, although we don't know what happens on the other side. So what gives you hope for the future?
Finally, an easy question. My students. I started teaching law school at the University of Michigan in 2001. And I've always liked my students. I've had terrific students all along the way. My students now are a little bit different, I mean, generalizations on average, than my students at the beginning, and maybe not in the ways that you're thinking. Because I think that my students are actually systematically different from my perception of what the present mainstream media image of university students is. Okay, I mean, like, between you and me, nobody's listening, right? My students are millennials, and some of them are hotheads, and some of them are whiners. But I believe there are whiners and hotheads in every generation, right? There's so much more than that. They are, for one thing, more ideologically diverse and subtle than they're usually given credit for. I have students with a wide range of views about a bunch of different things, and I have excellent conversations all the time. These are some of my favorite things about teaching them, where whatever their views are, right, my job is to make it harder for them to think whatever it is that they think, right? To teach them the habit of learning to see the weaknesses in your own idea, right? Because that's how you learn to live with other people, right? That's how you learn not to assume that you have all the answers. That's how you learn not to think that the person who disagrees with you is either an idiot or a liar, right? And it helps for humility and it helps for citizenship to realize that whatever your idea is, it has weaknesses, and I guarantee you it does, right? And my students are mostly quite willing to realize this, and they, like, at first, there's unease, right? Like, you're shaking the foundation, but then, like, they say, oh, like, this is important, right? And they want to lean into it and think hard and think better. And that, I think, is great. And many more of my students today than when I started are people who came to law school because they understand that our society, which has, I mean, we have in a lot of ways quite a wonderful society. Like, by the standards of world history, this is a pretty lucky time and place to be alive, right? But many more of my students today than 20 years ago understand that our society also has quite serious challenges. And they came to law school because they want to be part of the solution. I have always had students who came to law school for that reason. The proportion of my students who came to law school for that reason is noticeably higher now than it was 20 years ago, and I think that's great.
Let's give Dr. Primus a round of applause.
Thank you all.
That's a great way to close out our formal conversation. Let's do some Q&A from the audience, if that's all right. I see some hands that are already raised. So we have Julian walking around with a microphone.
Speaking of presidential bullying the Supreme Court, the case of the Cherokee Nation versus the U.S., and when the court ruled in favor of the Cherokee Nation, paraphrasing President Jackson, call out your army, Supreme Court.
Yeah. Right. That is to say, the reference is to a set of cases that were decided by John Marshall late in his chief justiceship during the Jackson administration, where there was a huge, complicated, corrupt set of land deals where in the end title depended on whether something belonged to the Cherokee Nation or to the state of Georgia. And John Marshall and the Supreme Court ruled for the Cherokee. And Andrew Jackson, it may be apocryphal, right, but as president, said, John Marshall has made his decision. Let him go enforce it, right? That's the pre-Civil War, pre-1890s state of play, right? It's the kind of thing that could happen in a world where the two parties hadn't agreed on a kind of rule of law détente that, you know, we as a country were lucky enough for them to work out, 60 years later at considerable cost.
Question just real quick. Professor, I know that one of your more interesting discussions is probably, I was a constitutional scholar at my law school as well, but the decision to grant some level of immunity to presidents. Nowhere in the history of the Constitutional Convention was there any discussion of that, right?
None.
Okay.
Oh, wait. I have to be very, very careful. There was no stenographer at the Constitutional Convention, right?
There was no C-SPAN
They're
back then?
like 55 guys talking all summer long, lots of things were said about which we had no records. And one of the problems with modern constitutional interpretation that tries to decide things on the basis of what they said is we only have snippets of their conversation. But as far as the records reveal, there's nothing.
Okay. Candidate H versus candidate T, and you have a president B. And candidate H wins by a little hair, and 3 states that decided it have Republican governors. And candidate T orders those Republican governors to seize the ballot boxes, thereby turning around those state electoral college votes. That's an illegal act, or it might be. Would candidate B or would President B, I won't say their names, but
It's all
would
purely
he
hypothetical.
be violating the law or abiding by his immunity and waiving future arguments to overturn that decision if he arrested candidate T?
So I don't.
All hypothetical.
Yeah. So here's the most important thing. I mean, there's so many unknowns. There really are, right? Constitutional democracy works best when it's boring. Like when we stay within the moves of the game on which there's something like knowledge and consensus. I do want to say one important thing, because I think it's a really important part of the conception of the rule of law, right? No president should ever arrest anybody, right? The president is the head of the executive branch, and the executive branch is responsible for taking care that the law be executed. But the kind of president who would want to go out and arrest someone is not someone who should get within 100 miles of the Oval Office. It's a personalization of what should be an impersonal function. You leave that to the civil servants, right? I know. Yes, but I really want to emphasize the point, right? Right. It is very dicey. Like, this is the playground basketball problem, right? It is very dicey to use force in a mass democracy, right, to settle an election, right? It's the kind of thing that doesn't happen just once. If it happens once, it'll happen again, right? That's why it's so important not to get to that point in the first place. If you get to that point, everyone is improvising. Like, you do your best, right? But in a minimally well-functioning system, we find a way not to get there in the first place.
And to that point, because we've talked about that first Adams loss, and you referenced that 2000 election, talk about how important that was. That maybe Al Gore had a path if he pushed a little further, to determine that he had won that election, but he didn't. He respected the rule, that last recount halt of the Supreme Court. Talk about how important that election was.
Well, I mean, I think you mean in terms of its keeping this game going. I think it was very important. I mean, I'll say a couple things about it. I happen to think that as a matter of law, the Supreme Court's decision in the Bush versus Gore case was wrong, right? I thought so on the day it was decided. I thought so on the day before it was decided. That's been my view very, very clearly. I also think that without that decision, if you play out the history of 2000, George W. Bush probably becomes president anyway, which means that I think that the Supreme Court sacrificed its integrity for nothing. But I do think those things. I think that what was most important about how Gore handled it was not that it altered who became president, but that it set an example for what a person in his position, a person who had a good claim, right, could do that in the public interest at that moment, right? he did not, he said once, right, I disagree with the decision. And his immediate next sentence was, but I accept it. He did not go out trash talking the judiciary. He did not go out trash talking George W. Bush, right? Like he said what he said, right? And he said, I accept the decision, right? And he was done. And
then had the role of certifying that election on
yes,
January
and in fact,
6th.
because the way the system works, right, as we all know, is that in the normal course of events, the presiding officer, when the electoral votes are counted, is the incumbent vice president. There was this wonderful, poignant moment in the counting of the electoral votes that year, because the two houses of Congress sit together, right, when they do that. And there were a few members of the House of Representatives who were from the Democratic Party who were very riled up about how the process had gone down and wanted to object to the certification, right? And one of them stood up, right, and at the appropriate moment for calling for objections, right, and started yelling, right? And the vice president, right, Al Gore said, the chair appreciates it, but hey, right? Like he didn't egg them on, right? He said like, look, fine. Like, yeah, I too wish that I were becoming president. But we're part of something that's bigger than that. And the something that's bigger than that, like sometimes it's gonna work out and sometimes it's gonna make mistakes. But it's the best technology we have for trying to live together peacefully under the rule of law. And if we forfeit that system, right, like, then we're in trouble.
I think that's an excellent way to end. We're at time, so I just want to thank Dr. Primus and Senator Moss for such an engaging conversation. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you all.